On March 23rd, the Trump administration announced new discriminatory measures against transgender people by banning them from military service, which had just been granted under Obama. While this story has received widespread coverage, likely because it threatens the U.S. image as a compassionate empire, it's just the latest attack on the trans community since the right wing took power. Before Trump took office, the same forces of bigotry were waging this war. In 2016 alone, more than 50 bills were introduced in Congress targeting the lives of trans people. But now that the conservative movement occupies the highest seat of power, they're seeing their anti-LGBTQ fantasies plow through federal institutions. Trump began this assault not even 2 months into his administration, canceling landmark legislation in the Department of Education that protected transgender youth from discrimination at school. Then, the Department of Housing and Urban Development withdrew 2 policies protecting LGBTQ people who are homeless. The Justice Department has launched multiple attacks, including issuing permission to private and state entities to discriminate based on sexual or gender orientation. The Department of Health and Human Services opened a so-called Religious Freedom Division to protect hateful doctors, hospitals, and health clinics that want to refuse healthcare to LGBTQ patients. And this just scratches the surface. Many other major steps backward for gay and trans equality have passed, mostly hidden from public view. The emerging anti-trans policies only exacerbate long-standing legalized discrimination. For example, in 30 states, well over half the country, one can be legally fired just on the basis of having a non-conforming gender identity. Likewise, in the same number of states, one can be legally evicted from their home for nothing more than being transgender. Of course, prejudice in employment, housing, healthcare, and more is commonplace, regardless of legal backing. That's why a shocking 71% of trans people report hiding their gender identity to avoid discrimination. The impact is devastating. Trans people experience unemployment at double the rate of the general population, and that statistic jumps to 4 times the unemployment rate for trans people of color. In fact, 25% of the trans community reports having been fired for not following gender norms. As a result, their rate of poverty is 4 times that of the general population. And 1 in 5 trans people report having been homeless. The emotional and psychological toll all of this takes creates the most tragic statistic of all. According to the largest ever trans survey, 41% say they've attempted suicide. Chase Strangio, a trans rights activist and attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union, explains the impact of anti-trans discrimination.
The reality is that the law, doesn't provide explicit protections for trans people, but even where the law is protective, we know that systems of discrimination are far beyond what the legal system will actually remedy. And so what we see are widespread discrimination in housing and education, in employment, which leads people, out of their homes at young ages, both because of discrimination in the education system, also because of rejection by families. So we see young people who are trans being homeless at really young ages. And then, in this country, we criminalize homelessness. So what happens is people are homeless and they're trans and they're people of color. So they face policing in so many different ways and end up being driven into the criminal legal system where all of those cycles are re-triggered. And then we have punitive systems that either keep people locked up or release people into so-called alternatives to incarceration that themselves are discriminatory, drug treatment programs, anti-sex work programs that actually reject their trans individuals who are participating, which just then again leads people back into the criminal legal system. And so unfortunately, we see incredibly high numbers of Black trans women, for example, facing time in prisons and jails. One study found that almost 50% of Black trans women had been incarcerated at some point in their lives. We have clients, we have people who call us all the time who are working jobs and they inform their employer that, they're trans and they're going to be transitioning on the job and then just, are summarily fired on that basis. But the reality is that as the advocacy community, we're not going to go down without a fight. The courts have been pretty consistent that trans people are protected. So we do have some tools at our disposal.
Talk about the measures that Obama took as president and if you think they went far enough.
Implementing the Affordable Care Act that provided, clear interpretations of the non-discrimination provisions, saying healthcare for trans people has to be covered, that trans people can't be turned away from hospitals just because they're trans, even though that's a major problem that people have been experiencing for decades. It was really, an important development under the Affordable Care Act, and then a host of other regulatory provisions that brought trans people within the protection of the law. All of that happened under Obama, and that was incredibly important for people's survival and protection. Of course, all of the measures that Obama took targeting immigrants, for example, in terms of this degree of deportations and enforcement of immigration law, had a terrible impact on the trans community. So many undocumented trans people ended up in immigration detention where they were horribly abused. I certainly don't think that the Obama administration's Bureau of Prisons was acting in a manner that met constitutional standards. So I think it's important to honor all that he did do, but not sort of glorify the last 8 years as if they were perfect when so many people in the community were struggling and targeted and dying.
Genesit Gutierrez is an undocumented trans activist organizing for La Familia, trans queer liberation movement. She made national headlines for confronting President Obama over the cruel treatment of trans immigrants in ICE detention. Tell me about the hostile environment at these centers.
There are a lot of human rights violations taking place inside immigrant detention facilities throughout the country. It's been well documented that the moment they are being held by ICE, right, the torture begins. Like, for instance, the misgendering, the humiliation, the harassment. There's been cases of physical and sexual abuse that takes place inside these facilities by other people in detention and including some ICE officials. So already many of our sisters are escaping a lot of the violence, the rejection by loved ones, right? The family that doesn't really embrace or understand our identity, the issues that we are dealing with. So it's really heartbreaking to see how undocumented trans women have to be put in these cages to be subject to so much abuse. For the trans community, especially at times for their own safety, right, quote unquote safety, they put them in solitary confinement to protect them, right? But we know that also solitary confinement, it's also another type of torture that once you get put into this place, it's really, it does have a toll on your mind and your well-being. Because of the pressure organizing has done, they have already, released a memo that they will respect the gender identity, but we know that the reality, that's not the case, because we're dealing here with the big issue of transphobia. Even if it looks good on paper, it doesn't translate to actually respecting people's gender expression, gender identity. So it's still, they have to face a lot of the mistreatment and unfair treatment that they received. So I don't think detention is the answer. I do believe to treat people humanely, we have to find a better alternative and let the community take care of. Or people, for those who have family here, are fortunate to have family, let the family take care of them. Those who don't have family, which is most of the cases for trans women, there is a community ready to protect them, that make sure that they are getting the basic needs, right, to be able to navigate this very hostile system and society that doesn't want to see us here in the first place.
So you famously interrupted Obama to highlight this plight. Why did you target him?
Part of us saying yes is because under his administration, we have the highest number of deportations. Almost 3 million people were deported, right? And that to me means separation of families that creates a lot of pain. And when I was inside that space with my own community who were supposed to back me up, who were supposed to be listening, right? And the moment I really challenged the president and spoke truth to power, they turned their back on me and sided with the president. To me, that was a slap in the face that it's okay for your sisters to be killed. Like we have other issues to prioritize, and you can wait, right? So even though, like, historically, trans women of color have been at the forefront, and I will always honor the legacy and the work and the passion and the dedication that Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, right, both trans women of color who really, really connected with the people that were suffering the most, right, the most vulnerable, the people, the sex workers, the homeless, and people dealing with so many issues that the mainstream community wasn't willing to listen to.
Are there any statistics about how many trans undocumented people there are living in this country?
In reality, we have, it's estimated to be at least over 160,000 undocumented LGBTQ people, but we don't really have a specific number of undocumented trans women across the nation. However, we do know that at least since Familia has been working on ending the trans detention campaign, we've been able to track down that at one point at the very beginning, right, when we started to put pressure here in Santa Ana, California, because the city jail has a specific section for LGBTQ people that they call it the LGBT pod, where a lot of the people inside these cages are undocumented trans women. It was estimated that at least about 65 to 70 undocumented trans women were in a detention facility. But we don't really have a specific number of once they get released. It gets more challenging to track down. And I think that is something that we need to think as a community. How do we make sure that we keep track of these individuals? How do we make sure that we are taking care of them, that they also don't feel left out, especially under this new current administration?
Documented or not, abuse from state institutions is just one danger they face.
2016, the transgender community was hit heavily with trans murder, perhaps one of the highest we've had on record. Those are the ones that we know, right? This is not counting those who go unreported or attempt suicides or suicides. So in 2016, we had at least 26 trans murder, and the majority of them were Black trans women.
Every year in the United States, dozens of trans people are murdered in hate crimes. Countless more are attacked. Can you talk about this hidden reality here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we often lose sight of, because so much attention about trans people is focused on the ways in which we're targeted by legislation, focusing on restrooms or focusing on sort of how scared other people are of us, is the fact that trans people are actually the ones being targeted so often, both by the government as well as by private individuals. And every year, the numbers of attacks on the trans community are rising. We're hearing about particularly trans women of color who are being murdered. Each year it's more, and a lot of this has to do with just cycles of violence that leave trans people more precariously situated, homeless, targets for police profiling, and all of these things contribute to the vulnerability to violence, both at the hands of people who are known to the individual and strangers as well.
And how hard is it to actually attain these numbers because of the misgendering and report inaccuracies?
Yeah, that's absolutely one of the big problems, is that oftentimes we don't know about the violence targeting the community, particularly when people are murdered, because the family members misgender the individual, reporters misgender the individual. And so that's definitely something that we're working on, and we are getting better numbers because there's more information, there's more community accountability and visibility, but the reality is that these numbers are probably, greatly underestimated.
This looming threat of physical violence is no doubt exacerbated by the ludicrous campaign pushing anti-trans legislation that centers on the fear of trans people in public restrooms. And I just wanted to say this as an offshoot, the bathroom thing, because so many conservatives literally do make this issue about bathrooms, Chase, and it's so insane because you just outline the horrendous state of trans rights all across the board on basically every social issue, but somehow this is truncated into an insanely absurd thing.
Yeah, I mean, the emphasis on bathrooms, I think, is just the sort of the Christian right and the anti-trans wing of the conservative movement has really tapped into an anxiety that we have as about bathrooms as a society, and they've been able to be very successful. And so they have used this fear of trans people, which is the thing that, of course, leads to all this discrimination, and they've capitalized on that fear by propagating myths about safety, about privacy, and have been able to really roll back civil rights protections in a host of contexts by exploiting the fear of trans people in bathrooms, which is in fact ridiculous, but people's sense of vulnerability in bathrooms is not ridiculous. And so, people do feel vulnerable in public bathrooms. They are disgusting. They are sometimes creepy. And so we tap into that to then say the problem and the solution is somehow expelling trans people from bathrooms, which will, of course, accomplish none of the stated aims in terms of increasing safety or increasing privacy. But somehow that has become this rallying cry. And actually the conservative, proponents of these anti-trans bills have gained a lot of support. All you have to do is run a campaign on myths and fear, and that's been the way that the movement against trans people has been incredibly successful. And I think now we're going to see that in a sort of broader scale, attacking a lot of communities. And say, it's the same thing we saw with sort of the myth of voter fraud, fueling these voter ID laws, the myth of trans people being dangerous, fueling these anti-trans laws. And all you have to do is sort of tell a story that it's scary to people, and then all of a sudden you have these repressive laws, and that's what we've seen at the state level, and I fear what we're going to see at the federal level too.
It's fueled obviously the Christian right. We have a Christian supremacist now in one of the most powerful positions in the world, Vice President Mike Pence. Talk about the threats under this new administration. I mean, specifically just the evangelical wing.
Yeah, I mean, this is from Pence through, the almost every single current nominee, we're seeing some of the most extreme anti-LGBT individuals. DeVos for Secretary of Education is incredibly concerning. She has a long history of supporting the most extreme anti-LGBT groups, not to mention that she doesn't seem to know or care about education, which seems to be another theme in the appointments. And Pence himself has really been sort of a leader of the anti-LGBT crusade from his time in Indiana. So who knows what we're going to see in Congress. And then we have obviously states feeling energized to continue their assault on LGBT people and trans people in particular. And we're seeing, too, a sort of emergence of what we saw in the anti-marriage context around religious beliefs about marriage and the investment in protecting people's rights to discriminate against people based on those religious beliefs. We're seeing a new sort of a new doctrine emerge about religious beliefs about trans people and the idea that there's some moral or religious belief motivating a desire to discriminate against trans people that is somehow a belief that one sex can only ever be the sex they were born or the sex they were assigned at birth, and that has a theological basis. So they're now defending these anti-trans beliefs in a religious way. And it is, I think at its core, what we see from these folks is that they just don't want LGBT people to exist. I mean, that is the solution for them. They believe in reparative therapy. They believe in, in converting people and repressing people and arguing in the trans context that actually it's actually just a delusion. So that's what we're seeing from people who have just been given an incredibly high platform in the federal government. So it is a scary time.
It is indeed. And let's talk really quickly about the conversion therapy, because that seems like something like shock therapy. Like, how the hell is this still a
thing, and the fact that Mike Pence was actually trying to lobby for public funds to do so.
Yeah, I mean, that's really this is what these people actually believe. I mean, they believe that that gay people, that trans people pose a threat to society, that the answer is not to provide people with the tools to be supported, but to actually find ways to make LGBT people straight, to make trans people cis. I mean, this is their solution. And if you see now in the cases that we're litigating against these organizations and the governments that are passing anti-trans laws, they really are bringing in experts to say that we need these laws because otherwise more people will be trans, and being trans is a delusion. And if you feed the delusion, it will cause all of these terrible consequences, and pointing to the suicidality and the discrimination as flowing from letting people be trans, not from having a society that is rejecting of trans people. So this is who we've now put into office, people who believe in subjecting people to reparative therapy, people who believe that the solution is to stop young people from being able to live as their authentic selves. So I think we have a lot to fight back against and a lot to be concerned about.
What are the fronts that we need to be organizing around best under the Trump administration?
I mean, I think we just have to be really vigilant in all of our organizing and really sort of work together to make sure that we are providing relentless people power, both at the state level and the federal level. We need to be telling stories because I think the laws only protect you so much, even at their best, and they can only be rolled back so much, even at their worst. But when you sort of entrench and you entrench, new cultural norms, and you do base building and power building, you really have a strong movement that can't be that can't be totally trampled by the government. And I think that's where we have to put our energy and really stand up for each other.
It's been like a roller coaster ride of emotions, and with all these executive orders back to back in a very short time, like that is something that they know what they're doing. They want to agitate people, they want to discourage people. It's really devastating. It angers me because, again, now they have the whole system, everything has been put in place. So now they're, the new administration with 45, I don't even want to mention his name, right? Because he's hurt so much our communities that now it's open, right? And he has made it very clear who the targets are, and that is communities of color. And that includes immigrant people, that includes the transgender community, trying to push us back and disappear our issues and struggles. And I'm glad that with all these hard feelings and emotions that many people are going through, people are really, some people for the first time are getting interested in joining the resistance, and that is the direction that we need to go.
Why is it so important to connect the struggles of trans and undocumented people?
This is a moment where it's so important to listen to those communities that are more marginalized, but also connect with other communities. And the way to move forward is essential to reach out to the Black community, to the Muslim community, to the LGBT community, all these other communities that have been attacked directly, openly. So this is the moment to really find ways to unite and come together and build a stronger resistance. And I do believe that.